Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here at American Cetacean Society, Monterey Bay chapter. I'm really excited for this month talk of April. So thank you so much for joining us. If you're new here, my name is Brian Fan. I'm the president of American Cetacean Society, Monterey Bay chapter. And if you're a member or if you've been with our chapter for a while now, also thank you. We definitely appreciate you folks joining us from every single month and all of our presentations that we have. So thank you. I'm really, really excited to have pretty much everyone from all over the US. We're really excited, and we have people from the Philippines and Washington, so thank you so much. If you folks have any questions at all, feel free to throw it into the chat. Any burning questions that you want to ask Zach about narwhals, or even just kind of different different morphologies of males and females of animals, maybe Zach can answer them. So thank you so much for joining us, everyone, and your questions. So once again, if you have any questions at all, feel free to throw it into the chat function. That's on the bottom part of your Zoom. So yeah, so what we're gonna do tonight is we'll have our presentation, and then at the end, we'll have a Q&A session with Zach. And then right now, I also like to inform everyone, thank you so much for donating and being part of ACSMB, because your donations and everything that you folks have done so far for us has allowed us to do our grants. And this year, we're really excited to give out our grants for our students of the Monterey Bay, from Santa Cruz all the way to Monterey and Moss Landing as well. So thank you so much for that. We were able to kind of decide on a project to give out for our graduate students. So thank you so much for that, folks. And then, yeah, let's get straight into it. So this month, we're gonna have Zack Graham with his presentation on sexual selection and the evolution of narwhal tusk. So Zack is a postdoctoral associate at West Liberty University in West Virginia. After receiving a psychology degree at Penn State University, he ended up in an animal behavior PhD program at Arizona State University, where he studied how and why male and female animals differ. This research has led him to study crayfish, beetles, and even narwhals. Zack's work on narwhal tusk has gained significant media attention and is among the first integrative work to provide evidence regarding the function of this trait. So thank you so much for joining us. And without further ado, Zack.
Yeah, how's it going, everyone? Can you hear me good? Thumbs up? Good? Okay, just making sure. Yeah, well, first I want to thank everyone for attending. I'm very honored to be invited to this presentation. This is something that I really love talking about, and I think it'll probably be a little bit different than what I imagine you guys normally hear, but in a good way. So the way I'm gonna go through this is I'm gonna give some background on myself, how I think about the types of questions I like to answer, and eventually we'll get into all the good stuff that I'm sure you guys are all waiting for. Let's see here. So as I was introduced, my name is Zack Graham. Currently, I'm a postdoc at West Liberty University, which is a small university in the northern panhandle of West Virginia. But I'm born and raised in Pittsburgh. I did my undergraduate degree at Penn State, and actually only pursued psychology at Penn State. That was, I thought I wanted to study humans. I thought I wanted to study human behavior. And I quickly learned that evolution was kind of the uniting theory behind all of those. And once I learned about evolutionary psychology, I was kind of hooked on being able to use some basic principles to learn about all animals. And I eventually ended up working with some lizards, and I also did some human work as well. But pretty broad background. I went straight from Penn State to Arizona State for my PhD. And, my PhD dissertation changed dozens of times, but I eventually settled on something that, I'm really, really, really passionate about. And it's pretty unique and it allows me to ask questions about lots of different animals. And like I said, now I'm at West Liberty. I'm technically a postdoctoral associate, but I also teach classes. So it's pretty much just like a mini professor position. And so, that's kind of like my background and where I come from. And of course, you guys are all here to learn about cetaceans. I've gone to plenty of Audubon Society meetings. I've gone to meetings for specific organisms, and it's really some of the best places to present because everyone's so passionate and cares so much and is really interested in what I have to say. And so, cetaceans actually aren't something that I've thought about nearly as much as other animals. More recently, I've been thinking about them a lot. For this presentation, I've obviously thought about them a lot, but we're going to get to the cetaceans eventually. But first, I want to give you guys some background about what types of questions I like to ask and how I ended up working with narwhals, and we'll get to everything like that pretty soon. And so what I actually study is freshwater crayfish. This is what I spend my life thinking about pretty much. I've been doing this ever since I was a kid. There's photos of me when I'm, I believe, 7 years old holding a crayfish. And I actually went back to that exact stream where I caught that crayfish for my dissertation to collect some data. So it's really cool. I've always loved these animals. They're so diverse. They do so many different things. There's over 700 species worldwide, and actually 400 of them live in the United States. So the United States is the diversity hotspot of the world for freshwater crayfish. They can be beautifully colored, as you see. They're not all just plain and brown. Some of them can be beautiful blues. Some of them are massive. Some of them are blind and live in caves. We can see these massive ones here in the genus Barbicambarus. I actually have a museum specimen. Hopefully you can see that. But they are just absolutely huge, like bigger than the size of my hand. And so crayfish are great for the types of questions that I like to ask, because one of the big things I'm interested in is behavior. I've always been interested in watching animals, understanding. And crayfish are one of the best animals to study behavior in the lab, because you can get a bunch of them and they exhibit a bunch of unique natural behaviors in the laboratory. And so my dissertation was focused on the fighting behavior of crayfish, actually. And you may not be able to see this video super high quality, but you can get the gist of it. And pretty much crayfish are amazing for this, because anytime you put two of them in the tank, whether or not they're males, whether or not they're females, really regardless of what species, they almost go at it instantly. Super hyper territorial, and they allow me to ask some great questions about, how these behaviors have evolved and how males and females fight differently. And we can see that this is a very ritualized and stylized behavior that has evolved from these crayfish. And so additionally, I study ecomorphology, so how the environment influences the way that animals look effectively. So some crayfish are massive, a foot long, and other crayfish, can get the maximum size is maybe an inch or so. And what I really study with these guys is a lot of the crayfish that most people are familiar with are what's called stream dwelling crayfish. So these are the crayfish that live in streams. You lift up a rock in flowing water, and you might find a big crayfish throughout the United States. But there's a completely separate group of crayfish called burrowing crayfish. And these guys, live in the mud almost 10 feet deep down. Sometimes they can be miles away from bodies of water. And I try to understand how this shift in habitat has led to the evolution of different morphologies and different behaviors. Getting into that, I also study evolution in crayfish. I try to see how these behaviors have evolved across the tree of life, the crayfish phylogeny, and I correlate this to different life history traits and evolutionary pressures. But the big thing that kind of unifies all of this is sexual selection, okay? And so crayfish are amazing for these studies because the males have these massive claws that they wield, and they'll swing them around during fights. And the female's claws are still pretty big, but they're reduced compared to a male's claws generally. And so these claws are what I spend a majority of my time thinking about, how these claws have evolved throughout the 400 species in North America. What different selective pressures have led some to evolve these long, thin, slender claws, and other crayfish to have these massive, meaty claws. Some have these massive notches on them. These are the types of things that I like to try to understand, these sexually selected traits. And so sexual selection can be broken down into a few different ways. And I'm going to break that down for you a little bit, and then we'll get into the cetaceans and how I'm going to link this together. So sexual selection can broadly be broken up into pre-copulatory and post-copulatory sexual selection. So this is the things that happen before they copulate. So pre-copulatory sexual selection is what most people think about. This is the female mate choice. This is the beautiful birds with their feathers, and then male-male competition, just like those crayfish that I showed you guys fighting. We also have post-copulatory sexual selection, though. This is not something I really have a ton of expertise in, but it's definitely relevant to pretty much any study organism. A lot of the time, this involves what we call sperm competition and cryptic female choice. And so just to kind of, give everyone a refresher on these basic mechanisms of sexual selection, because this is all sexual selection, but there's different mechanisms, and the different mechanisms often lead to different traits evolving. So we have female mate choice. This is kind of the classic Darwinian sexual selection, where Darwin was disgusted by the train of the male peacock. He didn't understand why it existed, but he didn't understand at the time that it wasn't all about survival. It was about reproduction. And this is the males with the biggest trains are the most attractive to the females, the female peahens. And so this is kind of female mate choice. This is one mechanism. Again, we have male-male competition. I love to think about the elk clashing antlers. In theory, you could study elk fighting behavior, but some people I know have done this. They've recorded 16,000 aggressive interactions between elk and over 10 years, and only 5 of them ended up like this. So elk aren't really great animals to ask these questions about. And then we also have sperm competition. And this is, one of the post-copulatory mechanisms of sexual selection. And this is a graph with primates. And we see that the primates that are more monogamous have smaller testes because they don't need as much sperm when they're mating. But when there's a mating system where multiple males mate with a single female, these are the primate species that have massive testes, and they use these to produce lots of sperm and to make sure that their sperm are the ones getting reaching the eggs. And so that's sperm competition. And so, this got a background in some of the sexual selection, some of the things that I like to think about. But now, what about the cetaceans? I've always actually, cetaceans are so cool. Just like crayfish, there's extreme variation in body size, extreme variation in body shape, and both crayfish and cetaceans are aquatic, but the way that they live their lives is almost completely different. They look nothing alike. Obviously, one's a vertebrate, one's an invertebrate, but there's still a lot of sexual selection going on in these environments. Maybe not quite as extreme as in other animals, but in some cases, the degree of sexual selection could be very extreme. And so that's kind of what I want to go through first. Before I get into some of the work that I've done personally, I wanted to kind of give a background on sexual selection in cetaceans. Now, I wanted to learn about what was going on, what we knew, what we didn't know, what types of mating systems were going on. And so that's where I'm going to start, is kind of giving an overview of our understanding of sexual selection in cetaceans. And I'm going to primarily focus on the pre-copulatory mechanisms, because those are the things that most often affect the external morphology of the animal. And that's what I have experience studying, the external morphology and the behavior. So we're going to be thinking most about female mate choice and male-male competition, although there is quite a good bit of work on post-copulatory sexual selection within these animals. And so one of the first things you can look at, and one of the first things that I found throughout cetaceans, is dealing with sexual size dimorphism. And so sexual size dimorphism is just the differences in the size of male and female organisms. So if you're thinking about humans, there's a little bit of sexual size dimorphism. Males are on average, I think, about 20% bigger if you kind of scale up the size and their mass. And that varies between cultures, but it's roughly that. And so generally we find that males are the larger sex in a lots of different species. And so this is true throughout lots of birds like the turkeys. This is certainly true of elephant seals, lots of frogs, and some fish as well. And of course, the massive horns of these dynasties, rhinoceros beetles here. But in other species and other clades, the females are larger. Okay, so we have variation in this sexual size dimorphism, and spiders are kind of the classic example where the females are often quite large and the males are really quite puny. And it really has to do a lot with the sexual mating system that each species goes about. And we could see variance within this, and especially variance within the degree in the direction of sexual size dimorphism, even within the cetaceans. So we could start out with the toothed whales. I can give some examples of what we know about sexual size dimorphism throughout the odontocetes. Generally, it's pretty variable within the toothed whales. A lot of the times the males can be larger though. And so this is definitely true with certain toothed whales like sperm whale, okay? And so the males can get 16 meters in length, around 45 tons, which is insane to me, studying small aquatic, crustaceans a lot of the time. Like these numbers are just astronomical to me. I love it. And then the female is actually a pretty comparable length, like 30% less, but the weight is like insane, only 15 tons for a full-size female sperm whale. And interestingly, the sperm whale nose, their auditory structure, their melon, which we'll get into in a second, is thought to be the largest sexually selected and sexually dimorphic trait that exists ever. And I think that's really, really, really cool. And maybe not relative size. If you looked at relative size, something else may be different, but just overall absolute size, I think it's definitely one of the biggest. And so these male sperm whales use this massive nose as a sound production mechanism and also reception of sound. And so the idea is that because they have bigger heads and bigger noses, that they're able to communicate better for longer distances. There's actually quite a good bit of evidence in this. You can't get these animals in a lab, but you can really study them out in the field quite well with all of these different auditory systems. In other toothed whales, though, we actually find the opposite trend, that females are larger. And so this is true within the vaquita, which is, of course, one of the most threatened and likely going extinct any day now porpoises. The females are actually larger, and it's not a huge difference. It's about 10% difference at maximal size. And this really has to do with kind of the evolutionary pressures that have selected for different mating systems. And so in the vaquita, when the females are bigger, generally reproduction is quite long and quite serious, and their life histories are generally quite slower. And that's, I think, definitely true with the vaquita, likely one of the reasons that they're on the decline. And then also some species are monomorphic, like the Indo-Pacific bottlenose dolphin. And so monomorphic, there's not very discernible differences between the males and the females. And in a lot of these species, if there is a difference, it's a very slight male bias. Only at the very extreme sizes you can really recognize this. So the toothed whales are super variable. It's pretty cool. I mean, this really reflects all the different mating systems they have. Sometimes males are larger, sometimes females are larger, sometimes they're almost identical. And now we can get into the baleen whales, the mysticetes. And it's super interesting. They actually have reversed sexual size dimorphism, where in all of the groups, the females are about 5% larger. Okay, and so 5% isn't a huge difference, but it is notable. It's indicative of male-male competition not being necessarily the highest within the baleen whales. And this makes sense. A lot of these whales are quite large, quite mysterious. And, you don't expect them to have, being super competitive over some types of resources, which is one of the dominant drivers of these sexual size dimorphisms. And so in addition to the size dimorphisms, we can also get into dimorphism in shape. So differences in the shape of the male and the female cetaceans. This is pretty common within the dorsal fin shape. So we can see within the orca, the males have these super long and tall dorsal fins, and the females are pretty much more reduced than the males, a little bit of curve into them. And so, this could have evolved for a few reasons. The ones that are out there are, there could be some different hydrodynamic effects. Maybe males need to swim a little bit faster or turn a little bit sharper. And also it could be just for sex recognition. A lot of times communication occurs, in these bodies of water, and being able to recognize whether or not you're communicating with a male or a female based on the shape of the fin can occur. And this can also occur in some really interesting different dorsal fins in their shapes. The spectacled porpoise, we can see the male up top has this massive fin, like it kind of looks like a top hat. I I don't know much about the spectacled porpoise, but I think their dorsal fin is really interesting, and I would love to kind of learn more about them. But overall, different types of sex differences between males and females. And so what I'm probably most excited about, though, and what to me I consider the good stuff, sexual size dimorphism is pretty cool, and sexual shape dimorphism is just as cool. What I really think is interesting is differences that are related directly to fighting or mating. Okay, and so we can get into the sexual dimorphism, and for example, the cranial morphology or the dentition of these different cetaceans. And so one different, so within the northern bottlenose whales, there's sexual dimorphism in the cranial form. So we can see that the males have kind of a more hardened, larger, exaggerated cranium. And, so we can imagine what this is for. It's actually much harder in the males than the females, and they may be ramming each other. They may be quite aggressive. If you notice in a lot of these photos I'll be showing you, the males are quite scarred, and that'll be something that we definitely get back to when we get into the narwhals. But, generally these rates of aggression within these male cetaceans are surprisingly high to me, an outsider, not someone that thinks about them and studies them nonstop. But super, super cool is that these sexual dimorphism and these kind of like sexually selected characteristics related to fighting. And what I'm really excited to talk about is these beaked whales. Okay, so this is beaked whales in the genus Mesoplodon, and they have these teeth. So this is sexual dimorphism and dentition, and Mesoplodon translates into tooth in the middle of the jaw. And a lot of these species just have these pairs of teeth that just shoot out from the sides of their jaw, the males specifically. The females don't develop these external teeth. And, I've learned that like the narwhal, these guys are super mysterious, super hard to study. We know so little about the 15 species of beaked whales in the genus Mesoplodon, even though they're actually the most speciose genus of cetacean with 15 species. And so getting kind of a better look at this, we could see the male on the left, and he just has these weird tooth structures that just shoot up out of his lower jaw. And those are the only external teeth that are extruded. And again, pay attention to these scars, lots of scars on the male, but not the female. Really, really interesting animals. And throughout this genus, there's tons of variation in the location, the size, and the shape of these teeth that are extruded. And so in some species, I believe this is probably the species we just looked at, Plainsville beaked whale. We have some other ones where the teeth are at the very, very tip. Okay. We have some others where the teeth are just about in the center. And again, lots of different shapes. Some are tall and thin. Some are pretty, reduced. And then some of them are ridiculous, like this strap-toothed whale, which I'll show pictures of in a second. Another close-up of these teethed whales are of these Mesoplodon cetaceans with these crazy teeth. We get to see how this comes up out of nowhere, and it's just super sharp teeth on the males. And these scars, I'm pretty sure that these scars are not human caused. I think they said that the eye in this photo was like just kind of like beat up and it wasn't natural, but these are the real scars that are on these animals and just the males. Here's another image of a Mesoplodon toothed whale, and we could see that again, lots and lots of scars. It's quite insane. One of the animals that I learned about when I was really doing all this research over the past good bit on cetaceans was the strap-toothed whale, another Mesoplodon. And the fact that these guys aren't like crazy examples in like every single book on sexual selection amazed me. Like I read all this stuff on sexual selection on peacocks and elk antlers and fiddler crab claws with these massive claws. And these strap-toothed whales are one of the craziest things, I've ever really learned about. So the males have these teeth that they call them the strap-tooth teeth because they just keep growing out of their lower jaw until they wrap around the upper jaw. And so it can become so extreme that they actually can't even open their jaw in certain circumstances. I think this is just crazy. This is just an artist illustration, but there's plenty of museum specimens and fossils, not fossils, but museum specimens that kind of like demonstrate this. Super, super cool and unique, weird morphology. Again, lots of scars all over, lots of markings. And like I mentioned, we will get to that. Here's another close-up. You know, we could see that literally they all also have these tubercles, which are just these little bumps on the teeth that they really don't know what they're for. But again, just completely coming out of the bottom jaw and wrapping up over the top jaw. And so it's a unique and strange way. Like I said, I really want to, next time I write a paper on sexual selection, I'm going to include some example of these animals. I think they're so cool and more people need to know about them. And one thing that I really love doing, you know, I got into animals through catching animals from as a kid, but I also, you know, loved giraffes and dinosaurs and fossils. And so one thing I always like to do when I learn about animals is we try to understand what we know about some of the extinct animals within a specific group. And so that's exactly what I did with cetaceans. And I found some pretty awesome stuff. Specifically, I found an animal that is pretty much the only animal that I think is comparable in its weirdness to the narwhal, and that's the Odobentocentops. And so this is an extinct cetacean that had tusks like the walrus, but it was a cetacean, and they were presumably sexually dimorphic. We have a good bit of skull evidence from these guys and skull fossil evidence, and only one of their teeth got extremely long and jutted out like this, and the other one was reduced. Really, obviously, this is an artist's reconstruction, but you know, we have a good bit of fossils from these Odobentocentops, and you know, this is like very kind of likely what they looked like. There's been a lot of work on this by a few people. So they have these asymmetric tusks. It's so weird. It's honestly like having two tusks like that in a primarily aquatic environment is already insane. You know, we'll talk about that when we get to the narwhal, but just the fact that you're carrying around these massive teeth, it's just absolutely insane that this thing, you know, occurred not too long ago. The function of this, you know, like I said, we think it's sexually dimorphic. So the skull evidence they have now suggests that it's sexually dimorphic. It could be used for fighting, but apparently they're pretty braille. You can imagine something that's that long. You know, these animals get roughly 6 to 7 feet. And so, you know, this tusk is like the size of half of my body. Tusk also may have been used in social dominance. This has been a key driver in the walrus tusk. Actually, one of the leading theories is that it was used kind of as a ballast, that they kind of orient their head downwards in the benthic part of the benthos. And this allows them to kind of more easily suck up mollusks and crabs and stuff like that. So, you know, kind of the ballast feeding function is likely. But again, if females don't have them, it's quite strange. It also could be used for predator defense, but, you know, I think this is the least. If I wanted to evolve something for predator defense, this is one of the last things I would want to evolve, is this massive backwards facing tusk that I only have on one side. Again, quite interesting. And the ballast and the feeding mechanism is called the orientation guide hypothesis, if you kind of want to look that up anymore. I think it's super interesting. I've read every paper on these guys. Here's an artist reconstruction of what that kind of feeding could look like. You know, so the males, these are all males here with their larger tusk on one side only, and they kind of like use it to orient themselves and keep their head flat on the ground. It's quite a, you know, a unique hypothesis, but I really love kind of paleo art and understanding. They're trying to understand things that we can't really study anymore. And that's honestly exactly what I did with the narwhal, which we'll find out. And again, here's another figure. They kind of think that this crazy tusk, which is the only really tooth that is comparable in its insaneness, the only sexually dimorphic trait within cetaceans that's comparable to the narwhal tusk. And that's why I kind of really wanted to highlight it, because I thought it was so unique. And, you know, the corollaries are there between the narwhal and the walrus and the Odobentocentops. And they actually believe that it's very closely related to the narwhal, more closely related to the narwhal than any other extant cetacean, which is quite interesting. I believe there's a specific morphology in the pelvic bone that showed them that. All right, so we covered some of what I would like to call sexual selection in cetaceans 101. And I think it gives us kind of a good background into how and why male and female cetaceans maybe look different, why some are bigger, some are smaller, why some have these odd morphologies like the massive teeth of the Odobentocenatops or the crazy weird strapped teeth of the strap-toothed whale. And now what I want to get into really is talking about the narwhals, okay? And so these things are absolutely crazy. The scientific name is Monodon monoceros, which means one tooth, one horn. Technically, it's wrong in both ways. If you're being picky, they technically have two teeth, but in the males, only one of these teeth protrudes. And, you can't really see me and get this right now, but, I'm a pretty tall, lanky guy. I'm about 6'5". And if I were to have a tooth that were similar to the narwhal tusk, this would be a tooth that is 5 foot tall coming out of my head and was about the thickness of a pencil. Do I have a pencil here? I think I do. This is a marker, but you can imagine this marker was 5 foot tall and it was coming out of my head. And if I was a narwhal, those are the exact same proportions that this tusk can grow. This tusk grows about, it can grow to be about 22 pounds. The male narwhals are about 3,000 pounds. It's absolutely insane that this morphology has evolved in the males and not the females at all. Oh, sorry, not in the females regularly. The really confusing part about this is that almost all males have the tusk, right? This is, from what we know, almost all males have the tusk. Sometimes a female will develop a tusk, which is really, really strange. And reports in the literature say that up to 15% of female narwhals have tusks. And, I'll kind of talk about that later, but I think that's, quite a strange estimation. The estimates are anywhere from 2% to 15%. So, that's pretty huge range. But these tusks of these narwhals are absolutely insane. One of the most charismatic and unique traits within all of biology. It's their modified left canine tooth, okay? So it's always the left one that comes out, if it comes out. And both of these teeth are horizontal in the narwhal. So you can imagine both of them are impacted right about here. There's two of them, just two canine teeth that are impacted. And then as the male matures, one of them will erupt, just the left one, okay? And this tusk, we call it a tusk because it's a tooth. So if you study sexual selection, there's tusks, there's antlers, and there's horns. And so tusks are modified teeth. Think of elephants or the strap-toothed whales. Horns are permanent keratin structures, and antlers are bone that are constantly shed. So that's why these are teeth, not horns or not. These are tusks, not horns, not antlers. And they always have this spiral. And there's been a lot of work on this spiral and trying to understand why it's spiraled. Normally, that's not a common thing within teeth at all. But it's thought to give it support because, again, this tusk can grow about 9 foot tall. The male narwhals, the largest ones, they'll be like 15 to 17 feet. And their tusks, the largest tusks, can get about 8 to 9 feet. I think the largest one ever recorded was about 9.5 feet, which, again, absolutely insane. Sometimes double tusk narwhals popped up, even more of a mystery. This is actually, you see deer and elk with these crazy antler deformities. And actually in narwhals, double tusks have been reported a lot in the literature, like dozens of times over the past, few hundred years. These people have been trying to understand this tusk for the longest time. And a lot of the time, the right one also comes out and it's actually a little bit shorter, which is really unique. So about 1 in 500 is the estimate, which, there's plenty of narwhals out there. And so that's quite a bit that have double tusks. And there's a double tusk at the Smithsonian, which I plan on visiting the second I can, because I really want to see that thing. Another crazy thing about the tusk is, remember, this thing can grow almost 10 feet long, about 8 to 9 feet. And so it's a huge, long structure. And actually, you can bend it 1 foot in both directions, in every direction. You can bend it 1 foot entirely. So it's not like a rock, like it's not like our teeth where you can't bend them at all. it's similar to our teeth, but imagine that our teeth were 8 foot long. Okay. And so, it's actually quite flexible, and that's going to be something that we'll come back to. So again, this just such a weird trait to understand, especially if you're like an evolutionary biologist like me. A lot of people don't even know that these tusks are real. They think that it's fake because that's what the tail of the unicorn is from. Of course, it's from the narwhal tusk. Most people know it from the movie Elf, and I've literally had dozens of students tell me that they did not know that narwhals were real. They thought it was just this made up animal from Elf. But it's actually, of course, very real. And it's been, kind of like one of the most mysterious animals around. The throne of Denmark is actually made out of narwhal tusks. And it was rumored back in the day that this was made out of unicorn horns, that the throne of Denmark was made out of unicorn horns. And later, people learned that unicorns didn't exist and that they were actually narwhal tusks, but are still just as curious. So we talked about these tusks a lot. And what really I'm interested in, and what got me interested in all of this, is what is the function of the tusk? I know how I would answer this question if this were on a crayfish that's this big and I could catch 100 of, but answering what the function of the tusk is within this Arctic animal that spends 90% of its life under ice is so hard. And so I was trying to learn about this, and surprisingly, not really many people have talked about this. I'm an evolutionary biologist. I study why males and females are different. I study this with lots of different animals. And the fact that nobody has really put an in-depth effort into understanding this with the narwhals was insane. And I really wanted to do something. And so now what I want to do is go over some of the presumed functions of the tusk. And so this is hundreds of years of people talking about what the tusk could possibly be for. And so these are kind of all the ideas that I took together. A lot of people thought that it was to disturb benthic prey. A lot of people think that it's a weapon, just kind of like elk antlers. An environmental sensor is probably one of the top presumed functions. It could be used for stunning prey. We'll see a little bit of evidence of that. Could be a cooling mechanism, this massive tusk. One of my favorite things when I first got obsessed with these narwhals, probably 4 years ago, I watched a YouTube video from National Geographic, and the video literally said, scientists believe that the narwhal tusk has no function at all. This is what they said in National Geographic. I was flabbergasted, I study how these traits evolve, and there's plenty of good explanations for how crazy traits evolve in other animals. And it was just hilarious. That only males have them, females don't, and they thought that it had no function. I don't know who was the scientific consultant on that. People thought it could be a quality signal. So this is kind of like the plumage of birds are called quality signals. People thought that maybe they pierce prey before killing it. Maybe it's used for sound transmission, kind of like the sperm whale. Maybe it's used to pierce thin ice to make a breathing hole. Could be purely used for mating. Could be for acoustic communication outside of just transmitting sound. Maybe it generates sound. And it could also be a signal during aggression. And so there's a few issues with this, a lot of these. And I'll go through some of the ones that I think are kind of the most plausible and that are the most unique. And so remember, these narwhals spend a lot of their time under ice, about 90% of their life under Arctic ice. And so you can't really study them. But one thing, because they're always under ice, and it's pretty hard to observe them, is that a lot of people thought that the tusk was used to poke holes through the ice. Okay. And this kind of sort of makes sense, but the tusk is super, super, super brittle. And the tusk is super brittle, and no one has ever actually observed this. Okay. So that's one issue. Another issue with this is that belugas face this same issue, but the belugas just ram their head through the ice, and it actually works quite fine. And people have actually seen female narwhals doing this. So it's kind of the opposite, is that the tusk hurts them in poking the holes through the ice. And again, this would be males only if it pokes through the ice. If a female needs to poke their head through the ice, or they just, hopeless, So, you really need to think about the female perspective with all of these different hypothesized functions. Next, we have feeding. A lot of people think that it's for piercing or for stunning prey. Piercing prey seems very, very, very unlikely because it's not sharp. It gets quite dull, especially in the older males. It's extremely dull, the end of the tusk. And so I don't think it could really pierce anything. It could be for stunning prey, even though like about 70 to 80% of narwhal diets are on pretty small animals, lots of small Atlantic shrimp, lots of really small, I believe these are cod, but a lot of the time, the only thing that could really stun is some bigger prey like squid or halibut. And so a lot of people really like this, really think that this is why the narwhal tusk has evolved for feeding. And that's primarily because a video came out, I think it was 2017. Let me see if it plays here. And there was actually footage filmed, some beautiful footage of narwhals using their tusk, smacking it side to side with some prey. So I don't know how good the quality of this video is, but they filmed these narwhals swimming together and flailing their tusks back and forth, apparently stunning prey. And so this is the first time it's ever been recorded. And the media went and hooed and hawed and said, this is what the narwhal tusk has evolved for. Scientists finally found it out, just based on this one recording. And, it's a hard thing to really say, especially because we don't know what the females do. Okay, so do the females not eat food? Do the males kill all of the food for the females? You really need to think about the female when you think about the evolution of this tusk and what's going on. And I think the females in this kind of like really is where a lot of the future research needs to go. But yeah, so it really doesn't explain that. And I think the tusk does have a function in feeding, could be extremely rare, but it was hard for me to believe that this massive thing would evolve just to stun some larger prey, which make up a small amount of their diet. And so, there's a good bit of these that, we think the ones that I think are the most likely are the ones that I'm going to investigate kind of and talk about a little bit more in depth are the mating signal. So this thing evolved as a signal in the males, but not the females. And so you think of these signals as, maybe the massive claw of a fiddler crab or the beautiful red plumage of a male cardinal. I'm going to talk about it as a weapon, a signal during aggression, which is an important one, and also as an environmental sensor, because it's probably the best effort put in this function as an environmental sensory organ. And a lot of this work was done by Martin Noia, who's a doctor at Harvard, or sorry, I guess he is a doctor, but he's a dentist at Harvard. And he has spent more time than anyone thinking about narwhal tusks and what their function is. He's done so much work with the native communities that have been killing narwhals for so long. He's gotten lots of traditional knowledge from that. He's also a dentist. So he looked at the sensory function of this tusk, and he found that, of course, there was hardened cementum on the outside, not dentin, which is what our teeth are made out of actually. And then it had a really thick inner nerve and pulp. You could see it's, this is all nerve tissue within the middle. Before this, I don't think people really knew whether it was hollow, whether it was all tooth. And so him showing this really kind of like changed things, and he's done a lot of work. And so again, he kind of showed this really beautiful anatomy where there's lots of nerves, lots of veins and arteries, and it all goes to their brain, connected through this tusk. And he took these micro CT images, and throughout the tusk are these holes. There's holes everywhere. And this is pretty consistent with it's being used to sense the environment, because it can sense what's going on and around the tusk. Okay, just kind of like our skin. Our skins evolved to react to different things in the environment. Same thing with the tusk. Lots of these holes, and they were absolutely everywhere. He had numbers in the paper, but there was, an insane amount of these holes. It's not like there was a few of them. And so another thing that he did is he took these narwhals and he actually captured some, and some of them he just put like a straight jacket over their tusk and pumped normal water. And of course, the narwhals were pretty stressed out with this normal fresh water. But then he also put this kind of vest or jacket over the narwhal tusk and pumped really salty water. Okay, and he showed that the mean heart rate actually increased. And so, this is pretty good evidence that they're actually sensing this, they're actually feeling this. And so Martin Nuia is in the camp that the tusk has evolved for a sensory organ. He's shown good evidence that it can sense pressure, temperature, osmotic gradients, and tactile sensation. So it's really a multifunctional sensory organ is one of the things that it can do. But again, what about the females? Do the females not need to sense the environment at all? Do they need to not know about these temperature gradients or the pressure gradients, or do they not need tactile sensation with each other? So again, it's kind of, he provided great evidence, but it really has to do with the females. We need some explanation of what this tusk does in the females, or why it's not in the females. And so this is a Risso's dolphin, and we can see again all of these scars. And so these scars are kind of something that a lot of cetaceans have, and narwhals have them too. And so this is one of the first things that I really started thinking of as I started realizing that all of these animals had scars, okay? And these scars are consistent with this tusk actually functioning as some sort of aggression weapon. So there's a chart from a paper in 1985, and we have body length on the x-axis and the number of head scars on the y-axis. And we can see that the mature males have tons of scars around their head, okay? The immature males have a good bit of scars, but not too many, and the females are rarely scarred. So something's going on with all of these males where they're getting all of these scars. It's really quite interesting. The dentist, Martin Nuia, doesn't really buy this because there's no photos of it. There's a paper in 1985. It's quite a big paper and a big deal, and one of the best papers at the time for the function of the narwhal tusk. But, we don't have photos of this, and he's been working with narwhals forever and has never really noticed these prominent scars. So it's kind of a mystery. Another thing that this Gerson and Hickey paper noted is that they had a few males with tusks actually embedded into them. And so, here's some quotes, is that one mature male had a tusk tip that was 9 centimeters embedded in the upper left jaw alongside the tusk. And another mature male with many scars had the tusk snapped off at the point of protrusion. So Gerson and Hickey were kind of along the boat that the tusk was as a weapon. And that would actually explain why the females don't have it, because only the males are the ones that are fighting, getting these scars. Again, this was from the same paper, and they showed the percentage of broken tusks. And so this is actually really important here, is that once you get a certain size, what Gerson and Hickey showed is that a lot of tusks started to break, presumably because these are when the males were starting to fight more. And again, this is something that Martin Nuia doesn't really buy, because he's worked with all of these tusks from live and dead narwhals, and he's never found broken tusks in the wild. What Gerson and Hickey did was use museum specimens. If you know anything about museum specimens, is that they don't get the best specimens. They usually get kind of like what's the leftovers. And so, these broken tusks actually may not be quite as common as this paper demonstrated. A lot of people don't buy it. And that's kind of demonstrated here in this picture. This is an old picture of a hunter, and sometimes these narwhals get stuck in these kind of like ice craters or these ice formations, and then the hunters will just kill hundreds of them. And you can see here, there's hundreds of tusks. None of them really look broken, far less than 30%. And so it's really, it's kind of an interesting mystery. And the last thing that I think is important is that maybe it's a mating signal. Maybe the narwhals with the biggest tusks can get all of the females. Maybe the females rely on the size of the tusk as a cue or a signal of the male's body size or the male's reproductive success or his fecundity or his quality. anything like that, is it could be a mating signal. And if you have a small tusk, it doesn't really work. But remember what the issue is with this, is that we can't actually really study the narwhals in the lab. They spend most of their time under ice like this, really hard to collect behavioral data. And so this is kind of the issue that I wanted to solve with my work on the narwhals. And so just to kind of summarize, we have, the tusk can be naturally selected. And so this is kind of like within males and females. And these are kind of the naturally selected functions: cooling mechanism, stunning prey, environmental sensor. And then we have a subset of natural selection, which is sexual selection, of course. And the sexually selected function is that it could be a weapon, could be a quality signal, it could be a signal during aggression or mating signal. All of the ones that deal with differential reproductive success between males and females are the ones that are related to sexual selection. And so again, how do we study animals that are difficult to observe? Well, the way that I actually started thinking about this is, like I said, I really love dinosaurs and extinct animals. And I study sexual selection, and I read a lot about sexual selection in dinosaurs and extinct animals. And there's actually a lot of work in these kind of extreme, bizarre traits within the fossil record. So we have the antlers of the Irish elk, which are 10 feet wide, the largest species of cervid ever. We have these massive teeth and saber-toothed cats. We have the horns of ceratopsian dinosaurs and the spines of these trilobites. And a lot of biologists actually started to study sexual selection in the fossil record. And obviously you can't observe these animals, but what you can do is you could learn about the morphology and how the traits grow as the animals grow. And I literally remember it was about 3 years ago today. I wanted to work with dinosaurs. I was thinking, what dinosaur can I work with? I was in my PhD, and of course I wasn't getting much sleep. I was getting kind of like research nightmares where I'd wake up in the middle of the night and I'd start thinking about crayfish and narwhals, and I wouldn't be able to fall asleep. And I literally sat there thinking, like, what animal can I study? Can I study a species of saber-toothed cat or maybe a fossil lobster? And then I had the idea. It literally came to me of narwhals. Does anyone know about narwhals? And that's kind of what sparked all of this. And so the way that we can study these traits that are like realistically difficult or impossible to observe their function, this doesn't mean that we can't learn about them. You can't infer their function based on what we do know about them. And what we can get is morphological data. And so the framework for all of this is called allometry. And so you can actually infer the function of a trait from the trait's allometry. And the allometry is just the differential growth of structures. Okay, so I'll kind of explain that to you. And so for a lot of these figures, we'll have body size on the x-axis and trait size on the y, and they're just logged to make it a little bit prettier in theory. And so what we know from years of research, hundreds of years of research, is that traits that are necessary for survival often scale isometrically. So if you have 1 unit of body size, you get 1 unit of the trait in question. Okay, so this is isometric, perfect scaling, 1-to-1. And we can use the example of the elk, just because I really love elk, and they're kind of like a classic sexual selection male-male competition example. And so if we think about these elk traits that scale, that are necessary for survival, scale isometrically. So the legs, both male and female elk need legs that are proportional size. If these legs are too big or too small, they can't run as efficiently. And so this is an example of a naturally selected trait. Okay, so naturally selected traits that are for survival, like legs and my arms maybe, and my toes, they scale isometrically generally. But what's really important is that traits that have sexual functions scale hypoallometrically. And hypoallometrically is anytime that there's a slope greater than 1. So if you have 1 unit of body size, you don't get 1 unit of trait size. You can get 3 units of trait size. And so the way that I like to think about this is, imagine you're in PowerPoint and you're scaling up an image, right? Imagine you're scaling it up in one direction much farther than the other direction. So you're making it kind of an awkward shape. And that's exactly what happens. And so it's not just that the biggest elk in the population are a scaled up 1-to-1 version of the smallest elk. The antlers are actually disproportionately huge in the largest animal. That's what this means, is that it's not, these antlers aren't just a scaled up version, they're disproportionately larger in the largest individuals. And so this is very indicative of a sexual trait. Lots of sexual traits have this pattern, and people have been showing this for a long time. You can also look at the variation within the trait. And so lots of variation is common in sexually selected traits like antler size. So high variation is the degree of variation around this line. And that's because these traits are condition dependent. The high quality males grow really big ones, big antlers, and the low quality males grow really small antlers. But the legs are so important for survival that there's very little variation. Okay, you need a properly sized leg or naturally selected trait. And within this framework, within these elk, you can use the non-sexual trait or the gray trait as a reference or baseline for the pituitive sexually selected trait. So you expect there to be more variation in sexually selected traits and hypoallometric scaling. And so again, you do not need to observe what these are for. You can confirm these traits are for sexual or non-sexual function, but you do not need it. You can just use the morphology to understand the function. And so in theory, you could do this exactly for narwhals. And so this is pretty much what I did with the flukes as a naturally selected trait and the tusk as a sexually selected trait. So we could learn about what this tusk is for without ever watching a narwhal. And so here are the predictions. If the tusk has non-sexual functions, remember that's feeding or as an environmental sensor or kind of the top ones, we expect both of them to have isometric scaling, no difference in scaling. But if the tusk has sexual functions, we think that the tusk in red will grow hypoallometrically. It'll grow super fast in these individuals. Furthermore, when we look at the variation, if it has non-sexual functions, we assume that there's a little bit of variation within both, no difference. But if the tusk has sexual functions, we assume that there's lots of variation within the sexually selected trait. Okay, and so those are the predictions. So how do we do this? This was the issue. I didn't have money to go to Greenland, where a lot of these narwhals are studied, but I made collaborators with people that did. And what they did is they gave me data that they've actually been collecting for 35 years. This is at the Greenland Department of Natural Resources. They've been collecting this data for 35 years. So I was, how old was I? I was -8 when this data was being, right? Yeah, something like that. I was -12 when this data was starting to be collected. They got this data from the local Inuit who have been hunting these narwhals for hundreds of years. Every time they kill a narwhal for food, they had the Inuit take tons of morphological data because they're trying to learn about the life history and evolution of these narwhals. So they just had this data sitting around and it was just literally sitting there doing nothing, 35 years worth of data. Within that sample of 587 narwhals, which is the biggest data set ever compiled on these guys, what I took was the body length measurements, the measurements of the tusk length, and the width of the fluke within the males and the females. And we only took data from adults because we don't want to get any maturity effects. You can imagine that there's certain maturity effects where once you hit sexual maturity, it grows really, really fast. And so we wanted to only use males, or adults rather, adult males and adult females. And so these are the measurements. Again, we have the body length, which is just from the base of the top of the tusk all the way to the fluke. We have the width of the fluke in gray, and then the length of the tusk. Okay, so what did we find when we did this? Well, not to my surprise, we found that the narwhal tusk exhibits disproportional growth, okay? And so the slope of the fluke is exactly what we imagined. And so we have body size on the X here, and then the length of the trait on the Y. Gray is the fluke, red is the tusk. The fluke, remember, they need a properly sized fluke. It is not sexually selected whatsoever, or it is not sexually selected, the width of it. And so it has a slope near 1, exactly what we thought. The tusk has double the slope, a slope of almost 2. So for every 1 unit of body length, these individuals are investing on average 2 units of tusk length. Okay, so these tusks are growing super fast. So the smallest narwhals are pretty small, and they have the smallest male narwhals have small tusks. Okay, but the largest narwhals have massive tusks. Okay, and that's exactly what this is showing, is that the narwhal tusks grow disproportionately. All right, so that's with the slope. What about the variation? When we look at the variation between the flukes and the tusks, we see exactly what I predicted if there's sexual functions. If we look at the coefficient of variation, the tusk is super variable, okay? About 3 times more variable than the fluke on average. So there's a range of sizes in the tusk. And this is, remember, likely because it's condition dependent, depends on the condition. Here's a visualization of the residuals. So pretty narrow residuals for the fluke, but the tusk residuals are all over the place. So remember, these were our predictions. And what our predictions showed was that the tusk has sexual function. These patterns are exactly what we would expect for traits that were sexually selected, okay? But again, what is the function, okay? What is the function? Just because we have this, it's really hard to actually say exactly what it's for. And that's why behavioral evidence and additional integrative evidence comes in. And so it's very likely to be precopulatory sexual selection, though, because these are the ones that are responsible for these massive traits in lots of animals, like the train of the peacock and the antlers of the elk. And so then what we did with these results is we kind of integrated it with previous knowledge on narwhal tusks. So remember, these things can grow massive, and people actually did some biomechanical studies on them. And so they showed that at the tip, the tusk was actually super, super weak. It broke if any force came down and impacted it from the tip. But on the sides, it was actually really, really strong. It could withstand a whole bunch of pressure on the sides. And so that kind of biomechanical adaptation can actually tell you about what it's used for, because it's adapted for certain behaviors that it's involved with. And so this started making me think about whether it was used as a weapon. We had this evidence that there were scars and that it could be used as a weapon. But, you know, if you think of it as a weapon, a lot of people originally thought of it as kind of like a jousting. You know, these animals are jousting each other and ramming into each other, and that's how these scars happen. But this is not really consistent with that biomechanical evidence. And so what's actually scattered throughout the literature, though, is this behavior called tusking. And so originally, this behavior was described as being very aggressive, where these 2 males are like kind of like sword fighting. But that's not really how it works. It's actually quite a gentle behavior, where the males just kind of bob up and slowly cross their tusks, okay? And they keep doing this in a very ritualized manner, almost in the same way that these crayfish were doing it. And so here's an artist's recreation that I had just to kind of like show what this looks like underwater. A lot of the times females, untusked females, will sit there and watch these males kind of like duke it out in this behavioral assessment almost. And so again, integrating with this on work on other animals, what I actually knew is that aggressive signals are more likely to exhibit hypoallometric scaling than other sexually selected traits. And so these are signals that are often used as weapons, but they're used to signal dominance, traits that are used to signal dominance. And so this is the claw of the male fiddler crab, super steep scaling, hyperallometric. This is the antlers of the stalk-eyed flies. Males have them, but females don't. These eye stalks. These traits exhibit hyperallometry. They're super, super steep, okay? Super, super steep scaling. And the narwhal tusk fits right within there. And so really, what we think is that this tusk is likely an aggressive signal. Weapon is probably not the word that we would use. It's not a weapon used to, as far as we know, it's not a weapon used to give injuries and win territorial interactions, but it's very likely a ritualized mating signal with this tusking behavior. And so all this evidence, again, supports the function that it is sexually, or supports the idea that it's sexually selected. It's not just for using as an environmental sensor, and it's not just used for stunning prey, even though it may be used for those things. There is some input on sexual selection. And, without more behavioral evidence, it's kind of hard to really determine what that is. But as an aggressive signal, that's exactly what the morphology points to. And so bringing it back to crayfish, I think it's super important that I actually know a lot about crayfish, because they have these massive claws. These massive claws are sexually dimorphic. They're bigger in males, smaller in females. And these claws aren't just for fighting in the crayfish. They're used for fighting. They're used as signals. They're used to defend from predators. They're used to eat food. So there's lots of different evolutionary pressures that act on these sexually selected traits. And it's really naive to say that it only has one function, okay? None of these traits likely have one function. And this is something that Martin Nawia has actually highlighted with his work, is that it's unlikely that these tusks have evolved for a single function. But what I showed is that there is definitely sexual selection pressure within this tusk. Again, another example, the tusks of elephants. They're used for foraging for bark, fighting, so sexual selection, and digging for water. This is a sexually selected behavior. These are both naturally selected behaviors, okay? But the tusk of the elephant show the exact same patterns of the tusk of the narwhals. And so really, how are we going to learn more about narwhals? Really, the only way is to go out there and observe their behavior, and that's not the easiest thing to do. It's expensive, it's not consistent. They're not like these crayfish that I study, where I can get 100 of them, throw them in a lab, and do whatever I want with them. Completely different story. One thing that I actually think will be the future of narwhal function, tusk function research, will be using drones, okay? So certain times of the year, you actually can observe these males doing this tusking behavior. It's only been filmed, to the best of my knowledge, like less than half a dozen times, at least like less than a half a dozen like individual events of it. So it really is going to require some like behavior analysis with lots of integrative work, similar to mine, to understand what it's for. Considering studying the morphology of these animals, the behavior, the biomechanics, it needs to be integrative. And so that's what I really think the future is with these animals. And that's really all I had for right now. It's been an amazing time being able to talk about these narwhals and all of this. And so what I want to do is just thank some of my collaborators that helped me with this. One of my best friends and collaborators, Alex in Brazil, kind of taught me everything I need to know about all of this. And then my two collaborators from the Greenland Institute of Natural Resources, Evergaard and Mads Peter, they were great as well, obviously supplying with my data. And so if you guys want to read the paper that resulted from this work that I did, it was published the week that COVID broke out. So, like COVID broke, and then a week later, the narwhal story broke. So I think it got like diminished a little bit, but it was still an awesome experience. Published in Biology Letters, very nice, reputable journal. You can get the PDF for free on my ResearchGate. You can send me an email. I'll give you a PDF of this paper or any of the other papers I talked about, because a lot of them are kind of like locked away behind paywalls. So if you guys have any questions, I'd love to answer them. But that's all I got. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Zach. If
Yeah, of course.
anyone has any questions, feel free to throw it into the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom. Thank you so much for that. I do, since we're going to wait until more questions come in, I do
Sure.
have a question.
Sure.
The photos that you've sent that was in your presentation of narwhals, they were all big numbers of them. Can you kind of talk more about, kind of possibly their social structures, especially since you were saying males are a little bit more sexually dimorphic, especially with their tusk?
Yeah. And so we know that these narwhals do these massive migratory herds, like huge numbers, like thousands. And, but surprisingly, the social structure and the mating structure of what's going on is super unknown. It's not like research on dolphins where we've been studying dolphin behavior and dolphin acoustic communication and social dynamics for like 50 years. This stuff is really just happening, but it's definitely some migratory patterns. And a lot of what we actually know doesn't come from the scientists. It comes from the traditional knowledge of the Inuit who have been studying and hunting these narwhals. Because if you're hunting them, you need to know everything about them. And so there's lots of rumors that the males lead the way and the females fall behind, and the males with the big tusks stay out front and the males with the small tusks stay in the middle. And so like a lot of it comes down to we really don't know, and it's all speculation, which I think is pretty awesome. But yeah, so there are these massive aggregations and we just don't know too much about them. And I'm going to go turn on my AC real quick. I can still listen though, so you can keep talking.
So thank you for that. Bonnie Gretz says, super interesting. Thank you. Nathaniel is saying, fantastic talk. Is there any data on the metabolic investment by the male narwhals, perhaps relative to other animals with sexual selected morphological traits? And then he also says, invest in the growth of tusk, that is.
Yeah, so there's a few things I can speak to on that. There's no research on the metabolic investment of tusk. But when we think of metabolic investment in the traits of animals, you can categorize it into traits that have inert tissue, so inactive tissue, and traits that have metabolically active tissue. So things like tusks in things like massive horns and beetles, it's all cuticle or exoskeleton or unmetabolically active tissue. And so teeth are generally not seen to be super metabolically demanding compared to something along the lines of, like a bodybuilder's bicep where there's tons of muscle, because muscle is super metabolically demanding, but exoskeleton and teeth and horns and keratin is not very metabolically demanding. So there's no data. I don't think anyone will ever get a narwhal in a respirometry machine. That will never happen. But I would love to see what comes from that.
So Marlene Maru says, thank you, Zach. Very informative. Looking to hear from more about narwhal's tox function can do. And then I have another question from WG. Any idea on their numbers and what is their range throughout the Arctic? How far south do they go? Thank you. Very interesting talk.
Yeah, so they're definitely an Arctic species and they have a pretty big range. The numbers of them, a lot of people assume because they're kind of weird and crazy and cool and people hunt them is that they're endangered or threatened, and they're actually stable. Huge population sizes, not huge genetic diversity within that, surprisingly, but it's not something that conservation biologists are worried about. As far as their range, it's pretty much all throughout the Arctic. They're most heavily studied, like 90% of our knowledge, no, actually 99% of our knowledge on narwhals comes from their breeding patterns when they come through Greenland. Because in Greenland, that's where a lot of the Inuit base camps are at. That's where a lot of the data collection happens. You can't really study them in open water. You have to study them when they're doing their mating migrations.
Awesome. I have another question then.
Sure.
When it comes down to looking at, narwhals and crayfish and other specimens or species that you've looked at, what is something, what's your next step, I would say?
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a bit, 90% of my work is on crayfish because nobody knows like anything about them. If I could gather 100 narwhals and throw them in a tank and study them, I'd be studying narwhals. And if there was 500 species of narwhals, I'd be studying the narwhals, but there's not. And so, I have a few projects popping up here and there. One of my collaborators is working on something with fossil elephants and mammoths. I have hopes of working on chameleons and chameleon horns and kind of like sexually selected trait evolution throughout the chameleon phylogeny. But right now, it's a lot of crayfish work. As far as the narwhal work goes, there's been talks. They're filming the largest documentary ever for Netflix, largest nature documentary ever for Netflix in 2024. And there's talk on making an entire episode on the narwhals. And so if they do that, they apparently want me to come up there and record data while they're filming. And so that would be amazing. So there's tons of, I could answer a lot of these questions because really the unknown is the behavior. If we could get a better understanding of their behavior, we could learn everything. But the fact that it's so hard to study them, it's tough.
So I got another question from WG. How long can they stay underwater? How deep can they dive?
I don't think they can dive very, very deep. I don't know the exact depth, but they can hunt. A lot of their prey during certain times of the year comes from squid. And so like these really like bentho squid and bentho shrimp. And so they dive for a really long time. And I think they can stay underwater for not as long as you would think. I think it's like 25 to 30 minutes is what I've heard. And we don't, the other thing, there's not data on this. It's all from the hunters. Most of our understanding of their behavior comes from the hunters because the hunters are the ones that sit there and wait for them to come up,
Inara says, is there any reason why the tusk is mostly grow out of the left side?
No clue. No one knows. It's the tusk is weird because it's asymmetric and that's their only teeth. There's no teeth inside their mouth. They only have those two teeth. There's two little teeth that are so impacted, kind of like our wisdom teeth that they have, but they're not functional, obviously. They're in the skull, but they're not extruded. And so no one knows why. Doesn't make really any sense. It's likely genetically controlled. I think people are actually looking into that now. Yeah.
Pat is asking, thank you, Zach. Thinking of some traits might be on a continuum from terrestrial ancestors, herd versus solitary, alpha status, detention as status, enforcement as you have demonstrated. So I think he's just reinforcing what you've been saying.
Yeah. The thing that's really rare about the narwhals is that sexually selected traits are exaggerated sexually selected traits are super rare within aquatic environments because the aquatic environment, you have to be streamlined, right? And so I actually have a photo of some, these are some long snouted dolphins, an extinct group of dolphins, and then the marlin, like when these types of traits do evolve, they're usually out in front, and they're really uncommon. Like not many species have these kind of crazy exaggerated traits in aquatic environments. And if they do, they're usually in the benthos, like the crayfish or the lobsters.
Angel Rodriguez is asking, amazing talk. I have a question related to the methods. Do you take into account the broken tusk in morphology measures?
Yeah, so that's something I kind of skipped over, is that there were no broken tusks in our records. And so that's kind of another thing where I think all those broken tusks were just from museum specimens. It's not a common thing in the real world. The other thing, we had the largest data set on narwhals ever. We only had one individual that might have been a female with a tusk, like not confirmed. You have to dissect it to confirm. And so there's only one that might have had a tusk, and we excluded that one as well.
Awesome. So I'm actually gonna stop the questions right now. So if you folks have any questions at all for Zach, feel free to email him. His email is on the screen. I'd like to answer, or actually ask one last question because we have a wide audience here. And the question is, if you have any recommendation or advice to anyone who wants to get into your field or to just be more active in science at all, what is your advice that you would give them?
I would say email scientists. Like I really love the types of questions that I ask. And once I started reading these papers, I started emailing everyone. Like everyone, even though I haven't met half the people in my field, everyone knows me. When I wanted to study narwhals, I emailed every single person that ever studied narwhals, that ever published a paper on narwhals. And I said, hey, this is who I am. This is what I want to do. Eventually, one of them gave me 35 years worth of data. So that's what I really think about is just, be yourself, send emails. People like me are super excited to talk to people that are interested. And that's what really I'd say.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you all have a great day and a great night. So thank you so much. And goodbye, everyone. Thank you so much, Zach.
Yep. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it. All right. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you, Zach. Good night.
Yeah.
I know it's late for you.
Yeah, it's real